I would like to welcome everyone to this last talk in our series, Economics Beyond the Swabian Hausfrau, for this year. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming actually the whole year, lots of you. Also, thank you very much, Julia, for holding this talk. Very, very generous of you. We feel very privileged. I would also like to thank Mona and Oscar, the two interpreters who are on duty tonight. So first of all, let's go through the formalities. We would like to thank Helle Panke and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung who make these talks possible. Without them, they would not exist. It's also very generous of them. Then, if you want to ask questions, you're not going to be able to speak online. We have this chat button. I don't know if it's also called chat in German. That's where you put in your questions. Sometimes people like to discuss with others or make comments. If you're doing that, that's fine. But if you have a question, somehow let me know that it is a question, because we'll go through them later. Or Julia probably will do it on her own. So try to designate the difference between a question and a comment. Then the next thing is, of course, Helle Panke is very pleased if anyone donates. There's a PayPal button on their website, which brings me to something much closer to my own heart. And that is that Brave New Europe has begun its fundraising 2021. It's our only source of income. We receive no money from any governments, from any corporations, from any companies, no, nothing. It's all donations. We receive some support for our gig economy project from a foundation. That's about it. So it's you. There's nothing else. And if you don't know what Brave New Europe is, I'll be very brief about this, but it's a website, www. I think you can see it there. It is braveneweurope.com. What it is it's a website with a holistic approach. That sounds very esoteric, but actually what it means, it used to be called interdisciplinary at universities. What we do is we take really various sides of questions, be it economic, be it political, be it social, etc. It doesn't really ever take an end, and try to analyze from these various aspects, because it's like anything, an isolated analysis never works. It looks very nice and very neat and tidy, but it never works. It's not right. So this is our approach. And what we really do need funding right now is we're trying to start a project. This may sound, you may think, what are they going on about? And it's concerning climate change. I don't know how much you're following the news, but after COP26, the CAP, that's the agricultural program of the EU, which was passed last night, which is comparably disastrous to COP. And now that we're getting the details of the EU's recovery program, which is actually what we've always said was going to happen, we aren't getting a green deal from the EU, we're getting a brown deal, which is supporting corporations, fossil fuels, and actually the corrupt political elite of the EU. And it's not going to solve inequality. It's really very antisocial, again, which is just, this is what the EU is about. So we're trying to develop a project with regard to climate change. Now you think, well, there's lots of websites doing this. Well, actually there are, but they're from an earlier time where climate change, unfortunately, was still a niche topic. And I don't know if you followed us during COP26, but we did a very intensive coverage of it. And probably we like to think it was the best coverage anyone did, at least from the critical side. And we did in those 2 weeks, I think, at least 60 articles from very, very good authors, very, what should I say, very profound, all of it, very proud of it. But this is where we want to go right now. This is our newest project, and we can't do this if we don't have any finance. So we're asking you can go to our website, www.braveneweurope.com. There's a donate button. It's not difficult to find. It's up on the top. And do donate generously. You are all we have. There's no one else. All right. With that, I'll just turn this over to you, Julia. And thank you once again for being here tonight.
Thanks to all of you. I just wanted to check that everybody in the chat knows how to have the translation. So there were some questions as to the translation. So before we get started, I just wanted to make sure things were okay with people. Hopefully they are. And with that, I will now share my screen, and hopefully you can now see it full screen, and I'm going to get rid of this. So hopefully everything is okay and you can hear me and you can see the screen. So thanks for being with us tonight. And I am going to tell you some of the research I've done and also point to some research other people have done. In this project, I was awarded through the Leverhulme Trust, which is called Living Well Within Limits. And so the question is it possible and what would it take? So this project is sort of it's in its 5th year. We still have another year coming up. And the results really started coming out last year. So you'll see what we came up with. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the climate context. I'll tell you a bit about the project and implications for research, for action, for what do we do. And actually, I'm going to start with this climate context. You might be familiar with this, with what I'm covering, but I really want to place this research in the context of the climate emergency. So this is a photograph from France. It's a village in the Alps called Vesubie in the French Alps. I'm just going to check the chat. So does somebody not see the PowerPoint? I'm just seeing in the chat that Chris and Pam do not see the PowerPoint. Do other people see it? I'm just sorry. I just want everybody to be okay. It says that I'm sharing the screen, so I can see it. A lot of people can see it. Okay, so hopefully it's all right. Thank you. Okay, so the climate context. So this is a photograph of Vesubie in France about a year ago. Was really devastated by a flash flood. Of course, Germany has seen a lot of flooding as well, and a horrific loss of life associated with that. So we're really in a case where climate damages are here with us right now. So we're already seeing impacts very strongly in every region of the world, and many different kinds of impacts as well. So I just wanted to sort of bring some results from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, which is known as SR 1.5. And what that report really does is it compares 1 and 2 degrees of warming to let governments know what they've signed up for under the Paris Agreement. So the first thing we need to do is we already need to know what level of warming above pre-industrial levels are we already at. And the answer there is that we're already at 1.2 degrees. So that is obviously, that was what was measured on average in 2020. So we're already very far in the direction of these 1.5 degrees. The other thing I should say, of course, is that 0 here is the temperature level at pre-industrial times before we started burning a lot of coal in the UK, for instance. So that was where 0 degrees was defined. So if we look at these impacts, we see deadly heat waves, for instance. So these are just some categories of impacts, not all of them. There's that deadly heat waves that would touch a certain percent of the population at least once every 5 years. At 1.5 degrees, it would be 14% roughly of the global population. At 2 degrees, 37%, which makes it 2.5 times worse between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The Arctic free from sea ice in summer at 1.5 degrees might happen once every 100 years. It would be once every 10 years at 2 degrees, so that's 10 times worse. Insect species losing 50% of their range, in which case they're considered at risk of extinction. It would be 6% compared to 18% at 2 degrees. That's 3 times worse. And warm water coral reefs would die out completely at 2 degrees. So there'd still be some left, a little bit left at 1.5, but at 2 degrees, it's completely over. So one of the things we have to understand is that we're facing a very non-linear system where impacts are massively amplified with each little fraction of degree of temperature. And that's something that's really important to understand, is that every fraction of a degree of warming that we can avoid through our actions will matter tremendously in terms of avoided impacts, in terms of lives saved, in terms of species saved, in terms of ecosystems saved. So everything we do, if we don't reach 1.5 degrees, we aim for 1.6. If we lose 1.6, we aim for 1.7, et cetera. So we have to keep it as low as we possibly can. That's the message here, because these impacts are really unacceptably high. So this graph shows the percentage of species at risk of extinction by 2100. So if depending on different warming levels, so you can really see that depending on the warming level, you have this massively different level of species at risk of extinction. Again, the risk of extinction here is losing about 50% or more of their geographic range due to warming. And you can see that at 1.5 degrees, percentages for all of these categories is below 10%. At 2 degrees, it already reaches 16% or 18% in the case of plants and insects. By the time we head for 3 or 3.2 degrees, it's almost half of all plants and insects and a quarter of vertebrates around the world, which would be considered at risk of extinction due to the warming. And this is such a huge loss. I mean, it's such a massive biodiversity loss due to climate change that and this is just, it's actually a conservative estimate in some ways, because it's only looking at one category of risk. There are many others. It's really inconceivable to me that we could have a stable form of human society if we're having that kind of impact coming at such a high rate of speed. So this is something really to pay attention to. So basically what's happening is that we are moving our planet out of the Holocene temperature range. The Holocene temperature range is shown here. It's in this picture. Again, you see 0 degrees here is the temperature at pre-industrial times. And you can see that the Holocene temperature range is sort of this very narrow sort of pink band of temperatures. It's only about a degree wide. And we've zoomed out of it. So we're sort of where this red dot is right now. And the Holocene temperature range is what we had for the last 12,000 years of human existence, roughly since the last ice age. It's where our species developed everything we consider important: agriculture, writing, cities. All of these things were during this Holocene time. And we, in terms of climate, have left it behind already. And we're heading into a very, very dangerous future as a result. And so what we really need to do is stay as close to the Holocene as possible. And that means our emissions need to fall off a cliff. They need to go to 0 extremely fast within the next couple of decades. So one of the questions we might ask ourselves is, why are we here at this very dangerous time where the Holocene is already, in terms of the climate space it was in the rear view mirror? So why are we already shooting out of pushing our planet into this very dangerous trajectory? So one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, who could possibly have known? This is a slide I always show because it's a slide that was, if you've never seen it before, I think it really is an illustration of both good and bad science. What it shows on the left-hand side is carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, so the emissions from greenhouse gas emission, the emissions from burning fossil fuels. And on the right-hand side, you have average temperature increase. So this plot was made by somebody who knew that concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere went with temperature increase. That's when it was absolutely clear in their mind, and they could model quite precisely what that could correspond to. This plot was done in 1982. So somebody around this time in the plot was making it. And they pretty much got exactly the trajectory for the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So 40 years later, we're pretty much on this curve for CO2 concentrations. They were a bit too conservative for temperature. We're measuring a higher temperature, sadly. And this has to do with the fact that there are other greenhouse gases being emitted as well as CO2, probably. Now the question, who developed this graph? So who knew already in 1980 exactly where we were going in the future? And the answer is, of course, Exxon, one of the largest fossil fuel, oil and gas companies in the world. At the time, they were not yet ExxonMobil. They are now ExxonMobil. And this was not a published report. This was a private internal report by climate scientists working for Exxon. And what we now know, what we've learned, is that fossil fuel companies were warned of the reality of climate change already in the 1950s. And that in the 1960s and 70s, they took it so seriously that they had internally climate science research, very good climate science research, as you can see, and that they kept those findings completely secret. And in around the early 1980s, they got rid of their science programs and they went full steam ahead into disinformation, denial, and delay. And we live in the world today, this dangerous world where people are facing climate impacts all around, and where we face such drastic and radical action to change our trajectory. That is because those companies made sure that their business could continue for the last 40 years. So I think that that's one of the things we need to take very seriously when we're talking about transformation, or we're talking about getting away from this problem, is that there are companies, economic actors, individuals who are guilty, who are responsible for our situation. And in order to change trajectory, we have to deal with them. And I think that that's a very important realization to have if you're thinking about economic transformations. I'm just going to check the chat again. Somebody is saying we already knew about this in the 1980s. This is, it's true that some of the science was known, and because the science was starting to be known in the 1980s, that's exactly why these companies went full steam ahead into denial and delay. So that's the reason that they went for that, because all they needed to do was create doubt. And that's what they did. They basically muddied the waters and made the world confusing enough so that people would not take action, that there was always an excuse for politicians, for the media, for industry not to take action. And in fact, they're still doing this, just in slightly more subtle ways. What are the implications for me? So these are my implications. This is what I sort of took home from this kind of information for my work. So basically, we need urgent and large scale action. We need radical emission reductions. Getting to zero or close within the next 20 years, say, would be nice. And if you take it seriously, the fastest and surest way to do that is to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels and energy. So reducing consumption doesn't require as much, at least, new technology or infrastructure. But up until recently, there was very little, almost no research into how you could do this thing of reducing energy consumption while and other types of consumption as well that go with it, while preserving or indeed enhancing well-being. So how do you reduce the scale of energy use in your societies while protecting your population or even allowing them to live better lives? And the fact that we haven't been considering consumption reduction. Everybody is always talking about acting on climate. Nobody is ever talking about reducing energy demand. Means that somebody like Kevin Anderson says we basically haven't even tried mitigation yet. So for my research, for this Living Well Within Limits project, we came up with a new framework. It's interdisciplinary. So we needed to sort of have a framework with which we would study this interdisciplinary information. And this is what it looks like. So the Living Well Within Limits project is, we call it LILY for short. And if you look at this plot, we basically tried to put everything we care about understanding in it and sort of relationships between them. So we definitely have to care about planetary processes, planetary boundaries on the left. And these planetary processes in effect also are linked with the resources, the natural resources that we take from the environment. And in this project, the focus here in the results I will show you is mostly on energy. And if you go to the left, to the other side of the plot, to the right, can't get my left and right confused. To the right, to the other side of the plot, you'll see that we have society social outcomes. And so what basically we have needs satisfiers, which is what people need to be well, and well-being outcomes, okay? And then maybe what's interesting is this thing in the middle. The thing in the middle is not the economy, it's not technology, it's both. So what we're saying is in the middle, there's a hybrid integrated object that is both physical and social. And I'll show you a bit of what that means when we talk about this object. So we're talking about provisioning systems that are both physical and social and interconnected. These two things act together. And this is an object of heterodox economics. So this project does not follow mainstream economics. It follows a heterodox economic tradition where provisioning systems are the object of interest. And that is what we do. Okay, so let's start with some early results that were led by my colleague Dan O'Neill. So one of the questions was, I don't know if you've read Donut Economics. It's a great book. I really recommend it extremely highly. And Kate Rayruths is an extraordinarily creative thinker and good writer as well. So she came up with this idea of the donut, which is exactly this challenge we face. How do we stay within environmental limits, planetary boundaries? So you can see that on the outside of the donut, you have the planetary boundaries. You don't want to go out there because you're destabilizing the systems on which we all depend to live. And in the middle, you have the things we need to live well. So you don't want to fall in the middle either, because that would mean that you have poverty, you have deprivation, and people will suffer. So where you want to be is you want to be not outside the donut and not falling in the middle. You want to be in this sweet spot, the safe and just space for humanity. And so what we decided to do is to look and see if we could collect some data and see if any countries were already there. And national results tend to look a bit like this. So you can see Germany, a lot of red on the outside. So a lot of planetary boundaries are breached, but not very much red on the inside. So a lot of human needs are satisfied. So the social foundations are reached in Germany very well. Whereas a country like Sri Lanka, there's no red on the outside, so no planetary boundaries are breached. And but at the same time, there's a lot of red on the inside, which means that there's a lot of social deprivation. Okay. It turns out that that result is unfortunately typical. So you can see in this plot, I'll just explain what it does. Every time a country transgresses a planetary boundary or biophysical boundary, we bump it up a notch on the horizontal axis. Every time a country achieves a social threshold, we bump it up a notch on the vertical axis. So that's what we do. We don't care about how much. We just say, if you're too far, you bumped up one. If you satisfy one, you bump up one. That's how it works. And you can see Germany doing very well socially and doing very badly environmentally. You can see Sri Lanka doing very well environmentally and very bad or quite badly socially. And you can also see countries that do the worst of both. And you can see that there are a lot of countries around where Germany and Sri Lanka are. And you can see that there are countries that manage to transgress tons of planetary boundaries. And also, and I should say this is these are all trade corrected indicators. So these are really related to domestic consumption in the countries and still have very low social thresholds. And what you can see is that the very, very lonely neighborhood, the loneliest neighborhood in this plot is where we need to be, achieving high well-being at low environmental impact. And that is just something that no country on average is doing right now. So then the research question becomes, how do we go from here to there? So every country in the world is now a developing country. We all have to transform the way our economies work if we are to be safe and okay. So this becomes the really big challenge. And so if you're thinking about this question, is it possible to live well within limits? The immediate answer is right now, it's not. No, not in current international average reality. And that's a pretty depressing answer. So then we need to find out how we can get inside Kate Rayruth's donut. And so I'll be asking I'll be basically bringing parts of answer to you. So the first part we can think about is equality and distribution. So this is a result that's not from my project. It's a result that's from the United Nations Environmental Program Emissions Gap Report. And what you can see is this huge inequality. So the red color corresponds to the top 1% income earner, and you can see that they have huge emissions, you know, above 70 tons per capita per person on average. The top 10%, which includes the top 1%, of course, have about maybe 25 tons per capita. The middle 40% have, say, a bit below 10 per, maybe around 7 per capita. And the bottom is, you know, about 1, the bottom 50%. So you can see this hugely unequal system. Globally, this translates to the fact that the top 1%, again in red, corresponds to 15% of global emissions every year, whereas the bottom 50% here in green corresponds to 7%. That means the top 1% emits more than twice what the lowest 50% of the world's population emits. And this is really scandalous. The top 10% emits about almost half of global emissions. So this is a huge problem. We see that distribution is a huge problem. And it led us to write a paper. This issue led us to write a paper in last year called Scientists Warning on Affluence, where we basically described how overconsumption is designed in by states, industries, and markets. So we basically show that affluence and overconsumption is a result of our economic system. It's necessary as an outlet for growth. There's a lot of positional consumption going on. So the affluent drive consumption in terms of norms and aspirations. And also in terms of existing in an unequal society, existing in an unequal society compels overconsumption as well, because you sort of consume to protect yourself in the case where you don't have good social services, which would allow you to be more equal, in fact. We studied within the Living Well Within Limits project, we decided to study not just international inequality, but also intranational inequality in energy use. So what we're doing here is we're looking at categories of income groups within countries, and we're also looking at products within countries. And we wrote this nice fancy title, and the BBC said, this is what your study says. So they reported on our study. We were very happy. They said, the rich are to blame, which as we've seen is kind of true. I'm not going to talk very much about the method, except that we're using, again, trade-corrected energy footprints. And what's really important here is that we're looking at categories of products all over the world. So in developing and very rich countries.
I'm going to stop for 5 seconds that we can change interpreters. We have 2.
Okay.
So you can begin again. Sorry about the interruption.
No worries.
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much to the interpreters. Okay, so here we're mapping these categories into 4 quadrants. And so the way the 4 quadrants are defined is that the top half of the plot is our consumption, energy categories that are consumed disproportionately by rich people. So if you're rich, it's going to form a higher percentage of your expenditure. And the lower half is disproportionately consumed by poor people. And if you split the left half versus the right half, the left half is less energy per dollar spent in the economy. The right half is more energy per dollar spent in the economy. And what was really interesting to us, because this is the first time anybody had done this, so it was really interesting to see what would come out, is that you see that the categories that are both high intensity and consumed disproportionately by rich people are all transport categories. And so you see that transport plays this really huge role in the energy use and emissions of the richer population, which, as we've seen, is a huge worldwide problem. And in terms of the lower high intensity category, that's heat and electricity, which is energy used in buildings. So you really see this huge split between energy used in transport and energy used in buildings. And this has policy implications, we believe, because, for instance, the luxury and high intensity quadrant is a problem you do not solve by growth. You will never grow your way out of rich people just driving heavier cars for longer distances, going on holiday, or flying more. So this is something where you really have to do taxation and regulation, whereas the reverse is true for buildings, because in buildings, if you're looking at it, people don't want to poor households don't want to spend a disproportionate amount of their revenue on heat and electricity in buildings, but they don't have the money to invest in either efficiency, retrofit, or low carbon energy sources. So this has to be a public investment. And so I think that we're really in very different logics here with these two categories of energy use. And I think it's really important to understand that. And if you are clever, of course, you'd tax the heck out of this and invest the revenue in that. And that might be a clever thing to do, in theory at least. Just, I'm talking to Germans, and I am not going to let this go. Cars are a huge problem. This is a study from the International Energy Agency showing how many, it's the additional emissions, additional CO2 emissions in the last decade, basically. And what you can see is, so power is electricity. You might have guessed that electricity expansion is causing a lot of CO2 emissions. If you have gas or coal-fired power plants. But the second largest category of emissions increase in the world is just SUVs. It's just cars that are heavier than they need to be, heavier and larger than they need to be. This is immense. This is a huge amount of extra emissions that are completely unnecessary. Nobody needs these vehicles. Nobody needs to be using that much petrol or diesel or emitting that much. Whereas you can see that all other cars, their emissions actually went down. So we're facing this really big problem with transport where we're really heading in a very, very unsustainable direction, and things are getting worse every day, and there's very little regulation of it. And so Tim Gore of Oxfam said, basically governments have to take action to curb this kind of emissions through taxes, bans, and so on. And I agree completely. So we did a study to see what would happen in theory. So we have this huge inequality, and we've seen that that's a big problem. What would happen if we made magically, we have a magic wand in our model, and we make the distribution of income more equal worldwide? We can make it more unequal, stretch it out even further. We can make it more equal. So because inequality of resource use comes from inequality in income, we can make this model, which basically looks like this. We don't have to go into it. But what it does is you can see here, these are schematics of the distribution in income, where the red one is our current distribution. It's the sort of S-shaped curve that's red. And then you can see things getting more and more unequal as you stretch it out, like I said, or more and more equal, where we try to make everybody basically have the same income. And what's really interesting is that the energy consumption worldwide changes very little. This is the net change in percentage points. So if the world would be basically completely equal, energy would go up by less than 10%, maybe about 7%. Whereas if we made it super unequal, even more unequal than it is now, energy use, all other things being equal, energy use would go down by about 3%. So inequality does not necessarily change total energy use. But what's really interesting is that it changes how energy is used. Because if you make the world more equal, you end up with people who have more of this kind of average low consumer profile, where they spend most of their percentage of energy use on buildings. That's where things would tend to go, and less of it on the pink part. So the orange part is heat and electricity in buildings. The pink part is transportation. Whereas if you make it more unequal, which is quite close to where it is now, a few people are using a lot of energy in transport. And as it turns out, decarbonizing buildings is easier than decarbonizing transport. So all other things being equal, a more equal world would be easier to decarbonize. And that is what Yannick Oswald wrote in The Conversation, if you want to have a look at his argument. So let's look at another part, which is socioeconomic factors. So how, again, this question, so we've looked at inequality. So inequality might help. Making things more equal might help. Now let's look at socioeconomic factors and see if they can help us get into Kate Rayruth's donut. So international energy demand versus well-being. So this has an equation on it, I'm very sorry, but I just want you to understand sort of what we're doing. We're looking at energy use internationally versus these need satisfiers. And that's a relationship with two variables, but then we're adding in information about these provisioning systems. So about the whole provisioning system, the whole socioeconomic system, where we're saying, hey, are you actually able to affect what's happening between energy use and well-being, between energy use and needs satisfiers? And that whole equation then looks like that. And what it means is that we can identify some of these provisioning factors shown here in the middle. Some of them will be beneficial. They will make it easier for countries. A high value of them will make it easier for countries to achieve high well-being at low energy use. Some of them will be detrimental. A high value of them will make it more difficult for countries to achieve well-being at low energy use. And these are the results. So basically all the indicators are the ones at the top of these plots, and all the ones that have a lot of green are positive, beneficial, and the ones that are have a lot of red are negative. And so you can see that across the world, public service quality, public health coverage, trade and transport infrastructure, electricity access, access to clean fuels, income equality, and democratic quality are all extremely positive. Urban population is a bit positive. Two of the ones we tested have no real effect. There's not really much there. Trade penetration and foreign direct investment don't really matter. And two of them show up as extremely negative. Extractivism, which means having an economy dependent on the extraction of natural resources, is very negative. And economic growth above a moderate income is negative. So this tells us quite a bit about the kind of society we would need to have in terms of its socioeconomic aspects that would enable us to go towards low energy, high well-being. It would be a more equal society, a more democratic society with electricity access and access to clean fuels for everybody. It might have more urban population than not. There would be very good public services and infrastructure, including public health. It would not be dependent on extractivism, and it would not be pursuing economic growth past a moderate income. So it's a very different society from the ones we live in now, which are very much dominated by growth and very neoliberal ideology around the market rule as opposed to public services. So that's something that's interesting to see quantitative evidence for. So let's go back to this question. So that was another element of the aspect, another element of the answer, what kind of socioeconomic aspects we need. Now, a third part of the answer would be around sufficiency and efficiency modeling. So what we did is we tried to model a different future. This is based on the Decent Living Energy Framework of Narasimha Rao of Yale University. It connects needs to sufficient levels of energy resources, to sufficient level of energy services. So human needs and energy services are sort of given, defined. And it's a global model. It takes into account technological improvements. So we basically say we're going to use the most efficient technology that exists today. We have a completely equal distribution in terms of access to energy services. We do not have overconsumption in this model. And the result is, as you might expect, lower energy demand. So what we're doing in terms of what the model looks like, we start with decent living standards. With these human needs, we basically have all of these require energy services for satisfaction. There were others where we didn't quite connect them to any particular energy services. Some of these were satisfied through personal consumption. We always included the direct and indirect energy of that consumption throughout the board. We also had public consumption of schools and hospitals. We had private consumption of offices and retail space. And then we also had general infrastructure. And so we tried to take everything into account, using the fact that we can rely on our input-output model to currently tell us what those factors are. The levels of energy services specifically for each person depended on things like demography, whether they lived in an urban or rural setting, whether it was hot or cold where they lived, the climate. And these are some of the things that they looked like. So we put the whole thing through in our modeling setup. And what we found was this kind of result. So what we're showing here is compared to IEA here stands for International Energy Agency. So the International Energy Agency shows past energy use. They have a reference scenario where it keeps going up like it used to. They have a 2-degree scenario where it sort of stabilizes around, let's say, 420 exajoules. These are exajoules, very large unit of energy for worldwide energy use. And below 2 degrees, they even have it going down a tiny little bit. And a previous low energy demand scenario led by Arnold Grubler got down to 250 exajoules. Our model drops down to 150. So in theory, it would be possible to reach decent living standards for every single man, woman, child across the world by 2050 at 40% of our current energy use and despite population growth. So that's a very, very different world, but it's a world at least without material poverty, which is already something. It's also a high-tech world and a very efficient world. Okay, so this is not going back to living in caves. This is everybody gets healthcare, everybody gets education, everybody has access to very good infrastructure and public services, but they have much lower personal and general consumption. So this might sound nice. So we might have learned a lot about how we could live better with less. So a good life for all might be within planetary boundaries, might be possible technically, but what is standing in our way? And one of the things we studied in the project, we really wanted to understand why our current economic structures are driving us in the wrong direction. And one of the things we did is we looked at the political economy of card dependency. And again, this is Germany, so I hope you're taking this to heart, because Germany is really a big part of the problem here, and everybody needs to take action. Okay, so we're looking at a systems of provision analysis of card dependence. So right now what we're doing here is we're really studying provisioning systems, this intertwined physical and social thing that is keeping our needs satisfiers card dependent effectively, keeping us in that space. So sorry, that slide got lost. So when we look at the political economy of card dependency, we're looking at 5 different factors. We're looking at the automotive industry. We're looking at car infrastructure, so roads and parking. We're looking at land use for cars, so land use planning, urban planning for cars. We're looking at neglect for public transport, which has happened all over the world, and also the creation of car culture. And those are the 5 factors that are important. I want to show you just a little bit of what this means for the car industry. So we're looking at the automotive industry, and it's really important that we can look at the car industry both from a socioeconomic perspective and a technical perspective. The 2 things together give us a lot of information. And I should say that this was research that was led by Giulio Mattioli, who is now currently at the University of Dortmund, who is an absolutely fantastic transport researcher. It was a joy to work with him. So one of the characteristics of the automotive industry is that it has high capital concentration. You have very large factories. So they are very concentrated and economically significant within a specific region. And that means that within that region, they have huge political importance. It doesn't matter if the politician is left or right, that politician is going to battle for the car industry because of its localized, concentrated economic importance. There might be other sectors like public transportation that have just as much employment and just as much of an economic significance, but because they're more dispersed, they do not have as much political importance and lobbying power. So that's one point. There's very high capital intensity, which results in large economies of scale. This means that there is endemic overcapacity and overproduction. So the fact that these factories are so large means that the car industry is very indebted and has to keep producing and selling in order to pay back those factories. And it also means that those factories are not worth running unless they're running at almost full capacity. So if a car manufacturing plant exists, it has to keep running at about 80% at least of its capacity. Otherwise, it is not worth it. It might as well just close down because they are going to be losing money. So that means that there's this constant overproduction and a need to continually expand the market, as well as various ways of, because they have to focus on certain kinds of automobiles, they focus on multi-purpose or they focus on SUVs, and you end up with lock-in mechanism on the consumer side as well. If we look at the road building industry, we found something very interesting. The road building industry is a political and economic chameleon. No matter what you're looking for, they're the answer. So they always appeal to economic growth. If you're in a mode of, if you're in a period of growth, you use it, you say road building is necessary to accommodate economic growth, and you need to have road building. If you have an economic crisis, you need a road building in order to stimulate economic growth again. So regardless of your economy, you always need to build roads. There's an appeal to popular consumerism, which works for the political right. So if you're talking to a right-wing politician, the road lobby will say, car infrastructure is required for freedom of consumer preferences, you know? If you're talking to a left politician, you say roads are equalizing. So roads are important for regional development and social inclusion. So car infrastructure is required for this region to grow and catch up with the rest of the country. So that appeals to the political left. You see road building as a solution to the problem caused by road building and motorization. So you say the answer to current transport problems is more road building. You appeal to technical expertise. You always basically say road building is always in the public interest. So you really see that this lobby has become very, very good at political communication and effectively capturing states, capturing politicians in order to basically always make them do what they want. If you want to read the paper, I really recommend it. It's extremely interesting. We went through all of these different sectors. I won't talk about this in detail, but we basically really mapped out how one had causes and effects that reinforced the other. And so one of the things that's really key here is to understand that we're talking about a system that has a lot of lock-in across these different causes. And so we really need to break up that system if we're trying to change our societies. So we're really facing a very dangerous system. These industries are very important. They have captured our politicians, captured our states, captured large line items of public spending. And if we want to get away from them and recreate something different, we really have to understand the scale of that challenge. So that's what I would like to say here. There's another aspect, which is an innovation around financial lock-in. So basically, a lot of the innovation in the automotive industry that is also driving SUV dominance is financialization. So you have all these different ways of paying or not paying for a car, but you end up paying more, and you also end up trapped in a debt relationship. And this is work done by Thomas Haynes Doran, which is not published yet, but I think will be very important in understanding what's going on. So basically, rather than have the new vehicles, the new financial mechanisms to induce car ownership, trap people into constantly getting new cars after a few years, because you end up trapped in a debt relation that is not worth simply not worth paying up. So you basically trap the consumer into a debt spiral. And that's one of the things that's driving the industry right now. It's also something that involves multinational state capture. I don't know how many of you have read this article, but it's really important how Orban played Germany's Europe's great power. So how Viktor Orban used the fact that the car industry was in Hungary as well to basically push his domestic policies forward. And as you know, he's a very, those policies are very terrible. So I think that this is a really important piece of journalism that tells us a bit of how that's happening as well. So I'd like to go from understanding to action. So this is pretty much the end bit of my talk. So I would argue that the urgency of the climate situation does not allow for gradual transitions, either in research or in reality, but really calls for radical transformation. I would argue that the popular movements, so the student strikes, Friday for Future, Sunrise Movement in the US, Extinction Rebellion in the UK, all realize this. How is, for me, from a university perspective, how is my research supporting them? How can we all contribute and participate? So how do we basically help use our information and our capacity to transform the world and really be part of the change that needs to happen so rapidly now? So this is a really important question for myself. I am part of the scientists who, follow in the footsteps of Charlie Gardner here and Claire Worldley, saying that scientists must act on our own warnings to humanity. So that we have a moral duty to join the popular movements that demand political action. I am part of the scientists who endorse mass civil disobedience to force climate action. We wrote a paper just recently, I think it came out this year, talking about how we can, as researchers, facilitate activism and advocacy in this time, and also protect climate and ecological protesters and earth and water defenders who are really being criminalized very heavily around the world. So this is one of the things that I wrote, that it has become abundantly clear that governments don't act on climate without pressure from civil society, which means that threatening and silencing activists is a new form of anti-democratic refusal to act on climate. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the translators for your work.
All right, thank you very much, Julia. Let's go over to questions. Just put them into the chat. I think everyone's done a lot of comments. I don't think I've seen any questions, to be quite truthful, but I'm sure they'll come quickly now. I just wanted to say one thing. The article, in case you're looking for it, it was in it's a very good website from Hungary called Direct 36 with a K instead of a C, and it's entitled How Orban Played Germany, Europe's Great Power. I'll put it up on the chat if you're looking for it. It really is a brilliant article, much worth reading. So how are we doing with questions, Julia?
Why don't you go ahead? I think I have the link. I think it sort of masked some of the content, so I'll just try to share it in the there we go. Okay. Also, I'm just think people would like to have the sheets. I can share them, so I can try to upload them and put them on. I'll try to do that now. So I'll just try to upload the whole thing. So some of it, yeah. Well, I'm not going to fix it now. So I'll just try to upload it and share the link with you. So that's one thing I can do. Do you want to read through and see if there are any questions in the meantime, Matthew?
Let me post one. I'll give you a question to start with while I'll start searching. It's been amazing. It's almost been Orwellian how COP26 has been presented. On the one side, we have success and hope in the mainstream media. And on the other side, we have climate scientists saying this was a complete failure. It was actually, what should I say? It was a disaster. Let's just get your take on it, please.
Right, let me just come back into the window. There I am. So I think things can be two things at the same time. Things can be progress and still completely inadequate. And I think the COP was that. It was both progress at some level. So some things got achieved. It was the first time that a UN FCCC document mentioned fossil fuels explicitly. You know, even if we didn't get to phase out coal, we still got to mention coal, which is already a big deal. But at the same time, that's pathetic, right? It's the 26th COP, and that's a pathetic result. So even the good results are pathetic. I think the biggest betrayal and disappointment is the abandonment of the loss and damage funding, the loss and damage facility. And so basically, pretty much every country in the global south had come together with this common demand of a loss and damage facility where they would could claim for climate impacts, right? Because climate impacts are caused by the global north, by the richest, especially if you take into account historical emissions as well. And the impacts fall mainly on the global south, which has the lowest capacity to deal with them. And if it's even in fact possible to deal with them. So there was going to be this loss and damage facility. That was the one demand that they were unified and asked for. And that was taken out by the European Union, the UK, Switzerland, and America. And that's something where I think it really falls on us, those of us who are in the global north. I don't know, I mean, this is the internet, so you could be anywhere, that's great. But in terms of the global north, we really have an obligation to lobby and force our governments to do this. Because the reason they took it out is because they can get away with it. They can come home and say, oh, we did great things. That's all. But it's just not an acceptable outcome. And that's something where we can make a real difference, at least in terms of that, of trying to set up this loss and damage facility. Nicola Sturgeon, the Prime Minister of Scotland, has taken the initiative to set something up and already put some money into it. So that's another thing we can do immediately, is demand that our governments put something in to this fund, basically get it started, even though it failed at the COP. I think that would be very important.
All right, the first questions are coming in. Let's start with, what is your perception of the level of savviness of politicians in regards to the eco and climate crises?
It depends which politicians. Some politicians are very clear on it. I would say most are not. I would say that the decades of denial, disinformation, and delay have worked on politicians. So I think there's two problems. One is that the climate denial worked, and a lot of politicians are sort of convinced it's not really real, or it's not that, even if it is real, it's not that bad. They're probably just exaggerating. It'll be easy to get a way out. So I think that's probably a lot of politicians are sort of stuck in the it's not that bad, or yeah, it'll be easy to get out of once we put our mind to it, but not now. It's not necessary to do now. It's not urgent. So I think that's really where their mindset is. And I think that both of these false understandings are the product of the fossil fuel lobbies and other industrial lobbies, like the automotive industry, like the airline industry, and so on, and also political ideology, that there's this market ideology that the market will deliver. So in fact, this is rewarded at the highest levels of the economic profession, because William Nordhaus was given the Nobel Prize days after the IPCC special report came out on 1.5 degrees, came out in 2018. And his work says exactly that. You can buy your way out of climate impacts. You can buy your way out of climate cataclysm. All you need to do is do nothing, just keep growing your economy, and it will pay for itself, and it'll all be fine. And I think that politicians, a lot of them got that message and are happy to live by it. And I think that's one of the things we have to understand, is that there's been a lot of disinformation coming from the academic sphere as well. So I think that's really scandalous. And I don't think that we've yet understood how scandalous that is. I just wanted to point out that Tim has a hand raised in the chat. As well, so.
Let's just work down the questions. We'll just work through. Are you sure about the overproduction, declining margins of profits in the automotive industry? I think current global developments contradict that. Automotive sector earning more and more and also become more and more profitable with less employees. Plus, most people in the world still don't own a car. The industry sees a lot of future profits in Asia, South America, and Africa, etc.
Yes. So yes, I am sure about the declining profit margins. The declining profit margins are for normal, so your normal car that people used to drive around in the 80s or 90s. The reason why we have SUVs is because the first runner, I think it was Dodge in the US, discovered that you could get out of this declining profit margin trap with SUVs. They were regulated differently, you could finance them differently, and you could charge a customer premium on them. And so then the rest of the industry followed. They're charging more through financialized means. One of the reasons their profits are higher is because people aren't buying their cars, they're buying debt. So this is also true of German manufacturers, at the luxury end, about almost a third or more of their profit margins come from financing. So they're not just car companies anymore. They've really shifted their business model. They're also banks. And one of the scandalous things where they give loans to people and demand repayment and so on. And there's so many scandalous layers here. One of the scandalous layers is that they're not regulated like they should be, because they're both the person selling you the thing and the person selling you the finance product. And it's the same person. So the customer is at a great disadvantage here, because they don't really, normally you buy something like a house and you get the finance from a bank and the two things are separate. When they're the same, you run into danger. And right now they're not, they're regulated as though they were separate, and they're not. That's one scandal. Another scandal is that the reason that car debt is considered safe, again, by these international financial standards, like Standard & Poor's and all those people, they consider car debt to be safe, much like they considered house mortgages to be safe. And the reason that they do that is because car dependence is so strong. So this is actually literally in black and white. What these financial ratings agencies say is this debt is good debt because people are so dependent on their car, they will go without food, they will go without paying rent, they will go without paying anything, but they will pay for their car. Because right now the car, they don't wait for you to be late on your payment for a month or 2 months or whatever. They turn your car off remotely after 48 hours if you're late on your direct debit payment in a lot of countries. So they really trap people. And so, you have these financial agencies saying, hey, car debt's cool because people will stop giving their children food as long as they can pay, so they can pay for the car. So awesome. It's really quite bad. So the car industry has changed in order to keep it is quite profitable, but the way they're making their profits has changed considerably. They've changed the type of product they're selling, and they've changed how they're selling it. And I think that it's a financial risk. It's also a climate disaster, and it's also terrible for the way our economies are developing. So this is all very bad stuff, and really needs to have a lot more of a spotlight shown on it, because it's I think it's just really dangerous.
All right.
Sorry for that long answer.
Okay. From Miriam, question. Do you think inaction is a result, at least partially, of lack of understanding of the issue and its impact on the inhabitability of the planet, or simply a result of corporate lobby, or both?
I think the lack of understanding is a result also of corporate lobbying, and also of an economic ideology that says that growth will save us. So I think I've already kind of answered the way I think that I think it's working out.
All right, there's another car question. Seems to be very popular, but there's lots of Germans here. About
yes.
the car case, isn't there a 6-point More and more people live in megacities, and the divide between land and cities, so that a lot of people need to drive by car because they don't live where they are working. Sorry for my bad English. It's quite fine. All done.
Yeah, so this question of needing cars is always a question of lack of public transportation and of land use planning that designs car dependence in. So it's possible to live without a car in a megacity, and it's possible to need a car in a small city if it's badly designed, right? So the spatial distance or even the lack of density is not the obstacle. So some studies have shown that it's possible to have good public transportation in low density areas like American suburbs. The thing you need to do is you need to guarantee interconnections. And again, this is something we talk about in our paper. You need to be able to guarantee that you will get from point A to point B on time, but you're going to need to change bus, you're going to need to change tramway or metro or whatever. So you need guaranteed connections, and that means that the state has to regulate that public transportation companies have to respect the timetable. And coming from the UK, where I lived for almost a decade, that's one of the things that makes public transportation a complete nightmare in the UK. You never know if your bus is going to show up or not. You never, no timetable is guaranteed, no connection is guaranteed, and you can just be dumped on the side of the road in the middle of the night, and that's it. Maybe you can walk home in the rain now. So that's the kind of thing that makes it. You need to have a public transportation system that enables you to get from point A to point B safely and fast enough. And then even in a megacity, it becomes entirely possible. In fact, megacities are being destroyed by cars because that volume of traffic causes gridlock and nobody gets anywhere. So you look at places like Lagos or large American cities or whatever, and you just see people spending their lives in traffic jams. So a car is not a way to get around any scale of city either in that sense. I don't like cars very much, you might have noticed, but I think I've got good reasons.
So, Jorge Camacho, how to convince or move, in parentheses, force, question mark, people that currently enjoy high levels of affluence to adopt sufficiency lifestyles for the sake of the planet and other people, question mark. Is it necessary, or should change only happen at the system level? Can you point to research being done in that direction?
So this is great because there was just very recently a fantastic paper by, I think it was Christian Nielsen, who was the first author. He's Swedish. So I'm just going to write his name in the chat. It was Christian Nielsen and who else was on it? It's nice when you can point to other people's research. Kim Nicholas. So Christian Nielsen and Kim Nicholas. I'm looking over there because I see her book. So I can try to find the link to it, but they basically said, okay, how is the lifestyle? What are the main things that rich people need to do to change? And is it individual change or system change? We need both. Well, we also have to stop thinking about either or. A lot of it has to do with both at the same time. So individuals change systems, individuals constitute and reproduce systems. So having individuals who refuse and break up systems also changes things. So we absolutely need both. It's not a question of convincing. So I don't have a magical argument or a pamphlet that I can give to Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Richard Branson that will cause them to give up their billions and stop having a lifestyle that's extremely polluting. By the way, Bill Gates is going around the world telling people we need new technology and has convinced Joe Biden and John Kerry in the US that we need new technology to deal with climate change. We do not need new technology to deal with climate change. We definitely need new technology if somebody is going to be a billionaire and low carbon. That's where you need new technology. It's because it's not possible right now. So we need to install wealth taxes, expropriation. All of these things would be things that would be necessary if we want to have equitable and climate compatible societies. So I think these things need to be done democratically. It's a question of through mechanisms like citizens' assemblies, raising the debate, raising the topic in the media. For instance, our article on the scientist warning on affluence, which I think was really one of the first times, we really shone a spotlight on like, hey, it's just rich people, okay? Like this is a huge part of the problem, was one of the most cited articles last year. So I think people are starting to care about this. The more people care about this, the more there will be an appetite for system change. The more there will also be within affluent classes, people within those classes who realize that they need to change the way they do things and be part of the solution by, for instance, giving up their wealth. I mean, honestly, that's the most important thing, is not to have that level of wealth anymore. But so it's not like, how do you live a different lifestyle? It's like, we need that money for public investment. We do not need it to be in private hands, really, honestly.
Do you know if there's similar research which is looking on resource use instead of energy use? In your opinion, what impact does the 2050 minus 60% scenario from your research have on resource use?
I'm sorry, I was looking at the answers. I think people have been finding and sharing the article by Christian and Kim in the chat. So thanks for that. I think they did find it. Great. Sorry, can you repeat your question? I was just trying to figure out if it was the right one.
All right, from Yannick. It's, do you know if there's similar research which is looking on resource use instead of energy? In your opinion, what impact does the 2050 minus 60% scenario from your research have on resource use?
Okay, so it's really interesting, and I'm really hoping that people will take up the challenge and use our kind of framework and apply it to resources, materials, metals, cement, rare earth minerals that, for instance, you need in a lot of new technologies, things like cobalt that also have a very bad social track record in terms of labor and really horrible labor conditions. So I really hope people will do that. So I'm not doing it yet. There's some groups, mainly in Vienna and Germany, that have the capacity to do this. There's research being done by Dominik Wiedenhofer and Fridolin Krasmann and Helmut Haberl at my old institute in Vienna, where they're starting to approach these questions as well. So I think that that's really one of the next steps. If you ask me to guess, the low energy future is also a lower resource future, not as low as you might think, because we need new technology, we need new infrastructure. That comes with a resource cost. However, that technology and infrastructure can stay around for a while. So we have a build-up phase, and then after that, we have a maintenance phase. We don't necessarily need to go into growth. That's something. The other thing is that if you have less demand, you also, at the same time, have less production. So a low energy demand future is also one where you don't need as many rare earth minerals poured into renewable energy, for instance. So it's a future where it's much more possible for renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, and so on, to supply that energy demand. It becomes entirely possible, feasible by anybody's scenario by 2050 to supply that level of energy with low carbon sources. But it's not as much as it might be otherwise. So in other scenarios, it would be a lot higher. So you would have more demand on rare earth minerals just for the energy infrastructure, for instance, or more demand for copper for the electricity transmission, et cetera. So I believe that it's also a low material use future, low land use future, but that still needs to be quantified. And I'm really excited. I hope that people are working on that. And I'm really excited to see what people are going to find.
All right, let's move on. There's a bloody lot of questions. I wondered a bit about the positivity of public health. What kind of medicine would that be?
Why is public health positive? I don't think that anybody in a time of pandemic needs to understand why public health is positive. I'm saying that a bit joking. I'm a cancer survivor. I have been all the illnesses in the world. I'm a chronically sick person. I broke both of my knees last year and have had multiple knee surgeries. So I am very pro health care. Public health care is great. I love doctors and hospitals, and vaccines are great too. Everybody should be vaccinated. with all the vaccines possible, take them, take all you can get your frequent card. But why is public health positive? Public health, in my research, public health is by definition possible because we're looking at well-being. And the way you help people be well is by having a health system that protects them. And you really see the impacts of not having that in countries that have this very strong growth at all costs neoliberal ideology like the US and the UK. In the UK where I lived, the health system is being taken away from people more and more and more. So we had this beautiful socialized healthcare system, the NHS, which still stands but is very weakened. And because people's health system is being taken away, for instance, people are waiting hours and hours and hours for ambulances for very bad health conditions, like a stroke. And people are dying in ambulances now. People are dying on their way into waiting rooms or emergency rooms. It's just completely impossible right now. And that's not just because of COVID, it's because the whole system is weakened, because of Brexit, they lost staff. So public health really matters to keeping people alive. If you're going to live a certain number of years, you're going to have some illnesses, you're going to have some accidents, you need to be protected. So that's by definition, public health is just really important. I don't know if that was the purpose of the question. I just love healthcare. Maybe that was a sideways answer. Maybe I didn't get it.
Do you think the term Holocene makes sense to push in the discourse?
Yes, absolutely. So you are all a lovely crowd and lovely people. And on Friday, I was in another lovely crowd, but they happened to be geoscientists discussing the Anthropocene. And it was perfectly socially acceptable for a senior academic there to say people are the plague. People are the plague on the planet. The solution is for people to disappear. And that was something he had no shame in saying, not just from a humanitarian perspective, but from a science perspective. He didn't think that that was a scientifically questionable thing to say. And when I mentioned the world capitalist scene, some people were like, oh, there is a different way to look at it. So I think it's really important to understand the root causes of our problems, because it avoids us wasting time with false solutions. When you understand the root causes in the early setup of a capitalist economies, systems of exploitation, extractivism, frontiers around the world constantly looking for cheap resources and new people to exploit. When you understand the history of that and where it has led us today, then you start looking for systemic solutions. And you understand that some categories of proposed solutions will probably not work because they go against that systemic grain. So it at least informs you of what you're up against. So I do think that the capitalist scene and the work of Jason Moore and Nancy Fraser and Andreas Malm and others is really important in understanding that and helping us understand where we can go.
Would you say that working with national and regional CO2 budgets would be important to understand that the situation is urgent? Our Verfassungsgericht, that's German for our constitutional court, called for it.
I think it is important because this kind of account, you have to work to targets. I mean, we do have these emissions we need to get down. I certainly think that doing it at a national and regional level is important. I think looking at both territorial and trade corrected emissions is important. So I would agree that having that scale is important. I think just looking, so we made a mistake in Switzerland. Switzerland is some of the worst climate policy in Europe probably right now, because we managed to not have we don't have any instruments that can enable us to be compliant with the Paris Agreement, which is not good for one of the richest countries in the world. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, is that our government has always said, sort of had a punitive approach towards this emissions budget. So always said, we have to tax carbon emissions and then we redistribute the revenue, or we have to, it's always this question of carbon pricing. And carbon pricing works beautifully in the models, or at least it did until we ran out of time. And now we have such urgent rapid emissions reductions that we need, that carbon pricing is no longer really the thing that that's much more suited to a sort of a gradual transition. And now I would argue we really need very strong industrial policies, like no more internal combustion vehicles, you know, where you just have sort of command and control decisions on which sectors get to live, which sectors get to die, which technologies get to be sold, which technologies cannot be allowed anymore. And I think that with this carbon budget, you have to do two things. You have to say, we're going to ramp it down by using industrial policy and various other measures in order to do that. But we're going to ramp up other things. We're going to give people this great public infrastructure, like the 15-minute neighborhoods in Paris, you know, where you can do everything in your life within 15 minutes on bicycle from where you live. We're going to give people fantastic places to live right where they are. We're going to give people really great healthcare and childcare and social security and healthy air to breathe and just better living conditions, more biodiversity, all of these things. We're going to make people's housing better, higher quality, lower cost to heat. So put not just the emphasis on ramping down emissions, but put the emphasis on public investment in making people's lives better and giving people jobs. There's a ton of work to be done. So when people say, oh, it's going to cost jobs, absolutely not. There are jobs out there. There are so many green jobs you wouldn't even believe. A lot of them in care work, a lot of them in making our surrounding areas higher quality. But so you sort of have to have both visions as well. One of the things I find really positive, it's going to be a link in French, but Roger Nordman, who's a Swiss politician, has just put forward a new initiative on public financing of climate. And I think that this kind of thing is a much nicer message to have than just, you know, sort of this punitive Calvinist, we need to reduce emissions. We totally do, but we also need to invest in very good public quality and good lives for each other. That would be my answer.
All right, we'll move on. But how do we create real pressure? Where is the power? This moment, for example, in Grünheide, that's here outside of Berlin, in Brandenburg, Tesla is building an eco SUV factory, and BlackRock is defining what sustainability is. Do you believe in green capitalism?
No, I don't. But at the same time, we don't have a choice. So in terms of action, anybody who is on this call has a lot more power in messing things up and changing things up than you think. So that's one of the things that I've been really learning a lot the past few years, is how the power of organizations. So individuals coming together and being part of organizations and working on campaigns. So you don't have to sit in the street and get arrested. If you want to do that, great. But that's not, that kind of action is not necessarily required to put pressure on people. The example I like to give now is, I've forgotten his name. He's such a hero. I think his first name is Chris. He's one of the people who tried to get British Petroleum out of culture funding. So they would basically, fossil fuel companies, automotive companies, et cetera, they buy social license to operate by funding culture and sports and plays and museums and all of these things. And he basically founded and worked with a group of people who were trying to get that to stop. And he researched things about fossil fuel companies. He went to the archives, he learned about them, and he's been able to very successfully campaign against them. And that is one person with a group of people. So he had, other friends and comrades and people working with him, helping him out. But he just poured hours a week into it, and he's made a measurable difference in terms of how we understand what these companies are doing in our society. So if you're interested in changing things, you have to become an active political campaigner. That is the single most effective use of your time. And that can mean a multiplicity of things. So whatever gives you joy, whatever makes you happy when you wake up in the morning, do it. You can do that as part of political campaigning. And I think that that's a really important lesson to understand. This is what we need to learn to do, because it is a fight. It has been a fight that we've lost completely, and scientists and academics were like the first in the losing crowd. But we have to learn how to do things differently. We have to learn how to become fighters in that fight. And in order to do that, that means political campaigning, that means influencing people, that means researching, that means really trying to shift things in every way you can. So in terms of how are we going to shift things, it's not going to be one solution, but it's going to be a lot of people helping to push this. And if you're listening to this, you can be part of that, and you should be part of that. So it's not a question of what we're going to do, what researchers are going to do, what Fridays for Future is going to do. What are you going to do? What are you going to sign up to? I mean, a lot of you are probably active already. Just, I really want to encourage you. You can make such a huge difference. But you have to see yourself as, you know, waking up and wanting to join this fight and wanting to really shift things around. That's what it's going to take. It's not just going to come from outside.
All right, I've been told we have to conclude soon, but we'll just continue with some questions. It's going to do this chronologically, first come, first serve. Julia, obviously this is dependent on your personality, maybe education, etc. But how do you recommend someone in the richer part of Europe with economic means and extra time spend those resources to direct us to a humanity living well within limits? Thanks for your wonderful work, M. Martin.
I think I just answered that. It's all about becoming an advocate and an activist, and that means different things for different people. So at some point I actually wrote blogs about one of the things we're not taught, or we're sort of taught to forget, is that we have power to change things, and that we can use our creativity, our intelligence, our connections, everything we do in our daily lives to change things as part of activism, as part of advocacy. But it's something that we're sort of taught, oh no, just be a consumer. Oh no, just be a voter. Like, we're taught to sort of put a lid on that. And it's really something where it's almost like rediscovering that you have like two other arms and two other legs, and another way that you can act and be in the world. So we have to relearn what it means to be part of the world when you see yourself as somebody who has the power to do that. So I'm just going to share this link to, it ended up being a 3-part blog. It might help give people ideas as to how they want to become involved, how they want to, the kinds of activities that are possible. And the other thing I really love, and maybe I'll even try to share my screen again, if I can get it all. Where is it? Yeah, so I'll try to share my screen. It's a really fantastic plot that says basically, so you're ready to take action on climate change. What are you going to do? And it's very much based in the US, but so, you know, do you know the basics? Yes or no? Yes, but I'm very sad. You get to go and be I love that. You get to be very sad in that little square there, and then you move on with your life. I love this part. Are you a yes or a no kind of person? If you're a yes kind of person, you can do these things. If you're a no kind of person, you can do those things. So, and I know I'm a no kind of person. I want to go fight the baddies. So maybe that's where I would focus my energy, right? So, but the thing is, there's all these different things that one can do. And it's all about working with other people, participating in campaigns, and really building pressure where you are in various ways. And you can do this. And it's also, if you're in the global north, if you're a rich person, I'll just share the link to that as well. Let's stop that. Yeah. If you're a rich person, I would also say that part of your duty is to subsidize activism of people in the global south. So Fridays, one of the people that are in the most affected areas. So Fridays for Future MAPA, most affected people and areas, I think is a really important thing. Helping financially Indigenous people around the world who are facing really, really high levels of repression for the work that they do in protecting ecosystems. That's really important. So I would think that we have a lot of work of solidarity to do, making their struggles visible. What's happening in Nigeria still to this day, in the Ogoni Delta, where Shell has committed countless crimes against humanity. You know, so we have that duty also to have to work in solidarity with those people, and to bring their reality to make that part of our world. So I think that that's also very important.
All right, unfortunately, my chat jumped and I don't know where we stopped. I'm just going to stop where I can see. So to reduce, we're stopping anyway soon. To reduce land area consumption, as indicated, would mainly mean not to eat animal-based food anymore. Above all other land area consumptions, because it is responsible for 80% of the land area for food production. Is animal-based food capitalistic as well? I.e., can shifting away from capitalism solve that?
Okay, so I hadn't considered the capitalism thing. So first of all, I was only, in my studies, I looked at energy because data is available and I know about it. But the food topic is completely clear. There is only one way through, and that's with plant-based diets. So the World Health Organization agrees, climate and biodiversity, everybody agrees. The only way through here is plant-based diets. So if you're in Germany or in Europe or wherever else in any kind of a more wealthy area, that is a huge thing that you can do right away, is just change your diet. So I can't say I'm completely vegan because I have a child and I feed him eggs and milk from time to time, but I would say 90%. And it's doable, okay? It took me a little while, but now it's doable. I can share my recipes with you if you want. Maybe, we can write cookbooks or whatever, but this is really, really necessary. Now, in terms of the economic system, it is also true that livestock agriculture, depending on parts of the world, is, and depending on the way it's done, not all livestock. So I'm not saying that all livestock agriculture needs to go away, right? There's some areas that are pasture areas. There's some areas that are traditional. That's not, but a lot of livestock is industrial. We're deforesting to plant soy to give to livestock. It just makes absolutely no sense. So this industrial livestock production has to stop. If you look at who elected Bolsonaro in Brazil, he was elected on a guns, cattle, and Bible, right, platform. That was literally the name of his party. That was their slogan. And that's who elected him. So you really have this very arch conservative, super rich ranchers. They dominate land ownership, right? So in terms of the unequal distribution of land ownership, livestock production is a big factor in that as well. So I think that the economic system there is definitely linked with exploitation and extraction, a really, really bad damage to both ecosystems and the workers in those areas, in those conditions. So in the US, meat packing plants are among the worst places, and slaughterhouses are among the worst places to work. And they're almost entirely staffed with recent immigrants, and they're really, really horrible places, unsafe, and yeah. And so this is an industry that is unpleasant on multiple dimensions as well. This is true. And so that is certainly something that's very important, is to move towards plant-based diets. I can confirm that.
All right. Would campaigning for universal basic services not income,
yes,
well, like NEF is doing in the UK, good, cheap, free public services for health, education, energy, housing, food, transport, etc. They can be redistributive, reduce uncertainties with regard to income, and would be taken out of corporate hands to be paid out of wealth taxes.
Yeah, I love the universal basic services are fantastic. Everybody should campaign for them. Really great. Completely agree.
All right. Next question. As someone else mentioned, the IPCC reports and COP statements explicitly omit the military as a major source of emissions and pollution. The Pentagon is the largest single source of pollution in the world.
Yeah, well, it's not the largest source, but the largest single institution. Yeah, so the military is a huge problem, and the military, again, has a huge role in doing various things. One is protecting a very unequal geopolitical order based on resource extraction from areas where people are very poor, and the resources are then used in areas where people are very rich. So that's one of the things the military is doing. Another thing it's doing is, protecting borders against immigrants that we don't want. Right, this evening, we had the horrible news that at the last I saw was 30 people drowned in the Channel. So immigrants trying to get from one part of Europe to another and dying on the way. So that's another thing that our military and borders do, is they kill people in that way. And they're basically set up around maintaining inequality in extractivism, resource use, and inequality in income and living standards. And if we move towards a more, so absolutely the military should be looked at and examined. They have the researchers who do that, I think there's really important research being done in that area, and I think there should be a lot more. And also, it's also true that if we move again towards a more equal state of affairs where everybody's needs are being met, public investment is available to make these public services and infrastructure, that at that point, it starts to being a question as to whether or not these huge military concentrations justify themselves. I don't think they're justified now. I think that in a future where we move towards less inequality, they will be even less justified. That would certainly be a hope, and that people would really say, yeah, this is just not an institution that is a correct way to do things. Yeah. And yes, they should be taken into account in emissions accounting and policy as well.
All right, this is the last question, and then we'll call it a day. I think our interpreters are probably exhausted by now. So I think the message that overconsumption by the rich is at the core of the climate problem has not cut through yet. On the contrary, there is a common narrative that poor people not being able to afford a low carbon lifestyle are an obstacle to cutting emissions. Do you agree? How do we change that? Should activists focus more on wealth taxes?
I think wealth taxes are climate mitigation. Yes, I agree. I think wealth taxes are very important. I also fully subscribe to the work of Thomas Piketty, the great French economist, and others, who point out that wealth inequality is also destroying our democracy. So it's also stopping us from taking decisions effectively in the common interest, right? So there are all kinds of reasons why wealth taxes are a really great idea, and everybody should be campaigning for them. That's one thing. The other thing is, in terms of affordability of low carbon lifestyles, again, we need this is the key, right? For achieving this living well within limits, we need public investment in excellent, available, universally available public services. And that's going to cost money. I mean, it's entirely doable technically within our work capacity. We can do it. We, as a group of people with a certain ability to do things, can do this even quite fast. But it's going to take resources. And those resources right now are unequally distributed and sit, a lot of them, in the pockets of rich people and financial institutions, sovereign wealth holders, all of these people. So the question is, how do we redirect wealth to the investment where we need it to be? I think wealth taxes are a great idea to do that. So there's all kinds of reasons why wealth taxes or taxes on carbon intensive consumption that are more associated with wealthy people are really important. So again, taxing the heck out of flights, having a frequent flyer levy, for instance, where, like, if you fly once a year, that's one thing, but if you fly twice a year, 3 times a year, 4 times a year, et cetera, the price goes up, by a huge amount, and then you're generating revenue, and you're also sending a social signal that this is really not socially acceptable. So wealth taxes, great idea. And you can also target it at unsustainable lifestyle items that rich people tend to overconsume, like large cars, long trips, flying, those kinds of things.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we're going to stop here, but it's growing late. Julia, thank you very, very much.
Thanks to all of you. I can't believe there's still 66 people listening. This is incredible. So yeah, well,
thank you, Mona and Oscar, for your.
Thank you so much.
That was brilliant. You've done this. And thank you, all of you. We'll be back in the new year. I assume we'll be back in January, February. There will probably be a lockdown, so it's probably a good time to be doing Zoomcast because everyone's sitting at home anyway and has time. So we'll be back. We'll be following the topic. We'll be following it this vein, this holistic or interdisciplinary vein, trying to put all the pieces together into one big picture. Once again, I would like to encourage you to donate to Brave New Europe and also to use the website. There's a lot of information. Almost all these questions have been addressed, not once, twice, or 3 times, but 10 times. It's also a lovely mixture because it's not only academics, it's NGOs, it's activists. So you're getting all the various sides. You know, not only what is the problem, but how can we solve it and what should we do? So do have a look in at the website and do donate, and donate generously if you can. And we'll see each other in the new year. Thanks again to everyone, also to Helle Panke and Luxembourg Stiftung that make these talks possible. Let's hope they continue their generosity in the next year. All right, good night to everyone then, and thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.